In 718 CE, a clerk in the Japanese capital of Nara logged an unusual tax delivery. It was not rice, it was not silk, it was fermented fish, sealed in salt, shipped from a distant province. It was payment owed to the imperial court. That single administrative record is buried in a legal document called the Yoro Code. It is the first written trace of something the world would later call sushi. The Yoro Code itself was modeled closely on Chinese Tang Dynasty legal codes. It was imported wholesale as a template for running a new bureaucratic state. Alongside fermented fish, the same tribute lists demanded salt, dried abalone, and seaweed. These came from coastal provinces required to pay in kind. An even older Chinese dictionary, compiled around 200 CE, already contains a character combining fish and salted. This suggests the concept predates Japan's adoption of it by centuries. The Nara period court also kept fish preserved in this way for religious offerings at Shinto shrines, not just taxation. It has nothing to do with the restaurant. It has everything to do with the government's need to store food as wealth. This is not a story about raw fish. It is the story of how a preservation technology was inverted over 13 centuries. What began purely out of necessity became its exact opposite. What began as a way to make fish last for months became something else entirely. It became an art built around fish untouched by a knife for more than minutes. That inversion tracks the transformation of Japan itself. It moved from a rice tax economy to a modern industrial nation. Rewind to the source. Along the shores of Lake Biwa, in what is now Shiga Prefecture, farmers faced a basic problem. Their rice paddies produced a seasonal glut of crucian carp, but they had no way to keep that fish edible for the months ahead. Their solution was simple and strange. They gutted the fish, packed it tightly with salt, and cooked rice. Then they weighted it under stones for up to a year. Bacterial fermentation did the rest. It broke the fish down and produced enough lactic acid to preserve it safely. Depending on the recipe, fermentation could run anywhere from 3 months to 4 full years. Lake Biwa itself is one of the oldest lakes on Earth, formed roughly 4 million years ago. Its age is part of why the crucian carp species used in funazushi is found almost nowhere else. Here is the detail that changes everything about how we should read this dish. The rice was never meant to be eaten. It was a fermentation chamber, a disposable wrapper, discarded once its job was done. This dish, funazushi, is still made today by only a handful of families near Lake Biwa. Its sour, cheese-like intensity is the closest living taste to what sushi meant for well over 1,000 years. A single, properly aged funazushi fish can sell today for well over $50. That price reflects how few producers still know the traditional method. If you traveled back to almost any century before the 1700s and asked for sushi, this is what you would have been given. You would likely not have enjoyed it. Traditional funazushi production is now protected in Shiga Prefecture as an item of intangible cultural value, in an effort to keep the craft from disappearing entirely. The technique itself was not a Japanese invention. Similar fermented fish and rice preservation appears earlier among rice farming communities near the Mekong River. This was in what is now Laos and Thailand. There, fish were abundant in the wet season, but scarce the rest of the year. Related dishes survive there today under different names. These include Thai pla-ra and Lao Padaek, both still made by packing fish in salt and rice bran. As wet rice farming spread north through China, this preservation method traveled with it. It moved into the Japanese archipelago, adapting to local fish and local grain along the way. Some linguists trace the word sushi itself. to an old adjective meaning sour, describing the fermented taste rather than the dish's ingredients. For roughly 800 years, after that first tax record in Nara, sushi meant narezushi. It meant long fermentation, months or years, sour rice discarded, fish eaten alone. Then, in the Muromachi period, spanning the 14th through 16th centuries, something shifted. Some regions began cutting fermentation time down to just a few weeks. The rice stayed starchy. It became mildly fermented, edible alongside the fish, rather than thrown away. This intermediate style was called namanare. It marks the first hint of cultural interest in the rice itself, as food, not simply as microbial packaging. The same century also saw Japanese soy sauce production standardized in temple breweries near Kii province. This was a condiment that would later become sushi's inseparable partner. Pickled ginger, gari, entered the meal for a practical reason too. Its mild antibacterial compounds helped cleanse the palate between raw fish of different fat content, long before anyone understood why it worked. Green tea served alongside sushi has a similarly functional origin. Its catechins were believed, even in the Edo period, to help settle the stomach after raw fish. But the real break came from a specific, dateable, technological substitution. And it happened in a city, not a village. By the early 18th century, Edo had grown into one of the largest urban populations on Earth. Edo is the city that would become Tokyo. Estimates place it above 1 million residents by the 1720s, that rivaled or exceeded London and Paris at the time. Roughly half of that population were samurai and their households. They were required by shogunate policy to live in Edo part of every year. A city that size could not wait months for its fish to become edible. It needed food fast, cheap, and constant. Around the 1750s, cooks in Edo found a shortcut. They began mixing vinegar directly into freshly cooked rice. This simulated the tang of fermentation in minutes instead of months. Historians associate this innovation with figures like the cook Matsumoto Yoshichi. A separate, equally important breakthrough came from Nakano Matsuzaemon, a vinegar brewer in the town of Honda. He developed a cheaper vinegar made from sake leaves, called kasuzu, instead of expensive rice. That single cost reduction is part of what let vinegared sushi rice become affordable street food. The rice itself mattered as much as the fish. Traditional sushi rice uses short-grain japonica varieties, polished to remove the outer bran layer. That polishing affects how well the grains bind together. The technique was called haya-zushi, literally fast sushi. It collapsed a process that had once taken the better part of a year into something you could finish before dinner. The fish no longer needed slow bacterial transformation to become safely sour. Vinegar did that chemical work almost instantly. A typical batch of sushi rice today still uses a ratio close to 1 part vinegar to 6 parts cooked rice, a proportion refined over roughly 2 centuries of trial and error. Once fermentation dropped from months to hours, an entirely new possibility opened up. The fish itself could now be fresh, not preserved. This is the hinge point of the whole history. In the 1820s, a chef in Edo named Hanaya Yohei is credited with assembling the pieces into something we would recognize today. He pressed a small block of vinegared rice by hand. He topped it with a slice of fresh or lightly cured fish. Then he sold it from street-side stalls called yatai. This style became known as Edo-period, meaning sushi, in front of Edo. The name was not marketing. It was geography. The fish came from Edo Bay, directly in front of the city. It was caught that morning and served that same day. Some of Hanaya Yohei's original recipes still survive in written form, and a handful of Tokyo restaurants today claim direct lineage back to his original stall. Picture the scale of this, because it was not a niche product. By the early 19th century, thousands of yatai stalls operated across Edo. Surviving woodblock prints and records confirm it. Nigiri sushi was, explicitly, a fast food, working-class product. It was closer in social status to a modern street food cart than to a luxury dinner. A single piece back then was roughly 2 to 3 times the size of a modern nigiri. It cost as little as 4 to 8 manars, cheaper than a bowl of soba noodles. People ate it standing up in 1 or 2 bites. They often used their fingers rather than chopsticks. Chopsticks themselves were already centuries old in Japan by this point. But nigiri was deliberately designed as finger food, which is why etiquette guides today still consider eating it by hand acceptable. Woodblock prints from this period, including works by artists like Utagawa Hiroshige, occasionally show these stalls directly, giving historians rare visual confirmation of how the food was actually served. Edo was not the only city developing its own sushi tradition at the same time. In Osaka, cooks favored oshizushi, that is rice and fish pressed together in a wooden mold, rather than shaped by hand. It produced neat rectangular blocks that could be sliced afterward. In narezushi, sushi rice stuffed into a pouch of sweetened fried tofu, developed around the same era. It was a cheap portable meal that required no fresh fish at all. Chirashizushi, scattered sushi rice topped loosely with a variety of ingredients, emerged as the least formal version. It sat closer to a rice bowl than to nigiri. In Kyoto, a separate pressed style, called batera, developed specifically around cured mackerel, since the city sat too far inland for reliably fresh seafood. The seaweed wrapped around some of these early pieces has its own hidden history of crisis and rescue. Edo-period fishermen in Tokyo Bay had learned to cultivate nori using bamboo and net frames called hibi. They did this without understanding why the method worked at all. For centuries, Japanese nori farmers had no idea how the seaweed actually reproduced. That mystery caused repeated, unexplained harvest collapses. Those collapses could ruin coastal communities overnight. In 1949, a British phycologist named Kathleen Drew Baker discovered the missing stage of the Porphyra algae's life cycle. Her research, done in Manchester and unknown to her at the time, allowed Japanese scientists to farm nori reliably again. This came after a post-war collapse. She is still honored today with a shrine and annual festival in the town of Uto. There, she is remembered as the Mother of the Sea. Nori production today remains concentrated in just a few bays, including Ariake Bay, where tidal conditions still closely resemble those the Edo-period farmers relied on. But there was a problem. Preservation had never needed to solve. How do you keep fish cold in a city with no mechanical refrigeration? The answer came from natural ice. Workers harvested it in winter from ponds and rivers in regions like Nikko. They cut it into blocks and stored it in insulated ice houses called himuro through the warmer months. For much of the Edo period, ice was a luxury reserved for the shogunate and feudal lords. It was not available to ordinary vendors. Ice merchants supplied both fish markets and sushi stalls. This cold chain was primitive by modern standards, but it is precisely what allowed Edomae sushi to serve genuinely raw fish, rather than fish cured through salt or vinegar for safety. Without the ice trade, nigiri sushi could not have existed as a daily food for ordinary Edo residents. A single himuro ice house could store enough winter ice to last a merchant through most of the following summer, according to surviving Edo period records. Government policy shaped this ecosystem too. Near Nihonbashi, a licensing and guild system concentrated the sale of fresh catch from Edo Bay. It formed a single, controlled marketplace, established in the early 1600s. That marketplace was the direct ancestor of what later became the Tsukiji wholesale market. Tsukiji opened in 1935 after the Nihonbashi site was destroyed. Tsukiji itself operated for 83 years before relocating to the newly built Toyosu market in 2018. By the 20th century, that market handled well over 2,000 tons of seafood on a typical day. A tax record from 718 CE had turned, across 11 centuries, into an industrial food distribution system. At its peak, Tsukiji employed an estimated 60,000 workers across its wholesalers, brokers, and support trades. Two catastrophes in the 20th century reshaped sushi's geography and status. They did more than any single culinary innovation ever did. The first was the Great Kanto earthquake, which struck in September 1923. It killed an estimated 100,000 people and destroyed much of Tokyo. This included the dense network of Edo-sushi stalls and the chefs who ran them. Survivors scattered to rebuild their lives across Japan. Displaced sushi chefs carried Edo-style Nigiri technique with them to cities like Osaka and Kyoto. A distinctly local Tokyo street food became, for the first time, something recognized nationwide. Disaster, not deliberate marketing, made sushi a national cuisine. Newspaper accounts from the mid-1920s described sushi chefs advertising their Tokyo pedigree specifically to attract customers in their new cities. The second catastrophe came at the end of the Second World War. Under the Allied occupation, Japan's government imposed strict food rationing and sanitation regulations. Those regulations effectively outlawed the informal street stalls that had defined sushi for over a century. Chefs could no longer legally sell nigiri from open-air yatai. Occupation authorities did allow one narrow exception. Restaurants could convert a customer's personal rice ration into a fixed number of nigiri pieces. That single rule is why a standard nigiri set still contains 10 pieces in many restaurants today. In response, sushi moved indoors, into small, licensed counter-seat restaurants. There, a single chef prepared each piece directly in front of a paying customer. This is worth stating plainly. The sushi counter format familiar today exists because of a post-war regulatory shift, not aesthetic preference. It also elevated sushi from working-class fast food into a specialized, expensive craft. Indoor operation carried overhead, a street cart never had. The knives used behind that counter became specialized too. A Yanagiba blade, single beveled and often over 24 centimeters long, is designed to slice raw fish in one smooth pull. That motion preserves the texture of the flesh far better than sawing. Many of these knives are still forged using techniques descended directly from Japanese swordsmithing, with some blacksmiths tracing their lineage to former sword-making families. Post-war economic recovery accelerated that shift in status. As Japan's economy grew rapidly from the 1950s through the 1980s, sushi moved further upmarket. Consider bluefin tuna. Its fatty belly cut, otoro, had historically been considered low-grade. Before the 20th century, it was sometimes discarded or used as fertilizer or fed to cats. By the late 20th century, that judgment had completely inverted. Otoro became one of the most prized and expensive cuts sold at auction. At Tokyo's fish markets, individual prize bluefin tuna have sold at New Year auctions for prices exceeding hundreds of thousands of dollars for a single fish. In 2019, sushi restaurant owner Kiyoshi Kimura paid over $3 million for a single 278-kilogram bluefin. That sale took place at the first Toyosu auction. A cut once considered nearly worthless became a symbol of extreme luxury. That same demand has pushed Pacific bluefin populations low enough that international bodies now impose strict annual catch quotas. A single large bluefin, once processed, can be cut into over 100 distinct portions. Fat content varies dramatically from the belly to the back. A wild bluefin can also reach speeds of over 70 kilometers per hour. A physical trait tied directly to the muscle structure that gives its fattiest cuts their prized texture. Wasabi followed its own quieter but equally distorted path. Genuine wasabi is a slow-growing plant that requires clean, cold, flowing mountain water. It takes up to 2 years to mature into a usable rhizome. Because true wasabi is expensive and difficult to farm at scale, most sushi restaurants worldwide serve a substitute instead. That substitute is typically made from horseradish, mustard, and green dye. Even within Japan, authentic fresh-grated wasabi remains a marker of a higher-end restaurant, not the everyday standard. The Izu Peninsula remains one of the few regions in Japan still capable of commercial-scale genuine wasabi cultivation, thanks to its consistent spring water supply. Sushi spread beyond Japan followed a similarly specific, documented path, not a vague cultural diffusion. Japanese immigration to the United States created small immigrant communities. This happened especially in Los Angeles and Hawaii from the late 19th century onward. These communities kept some traditional food practices alive, but sushi restaurants serving a broader American public did not appear in real numbers until the 1960s. A frequently cited turning point came in the early 1970s in Los Angeles with the invention of the California roll. Chef Ichiro Mashita, working at a restaurant called Tokyo Kaikan, is credited with the idea. Mashita reportedly reversed the roll, hiding the seaweed inside a layer of rice instead of leaving it visible. He did this specifically because American customers were unfamiliar with the look and texture of visible nori. He also swapped in avocado for the fattier cuts of tuna that were difficult to import consistently at the time. Avocado offered a similar fatty, buttery mouthfeel without the supply problem. This single substitution was driven by logistics and unfamiliar taste, not any Japanese culinary tradition. It became the gateway dish that introduced millions of non-Japanese diners to sushi. It was, in miniature, the same pattern of pragmatic adaptation that had produced haya-zushi 2 centuries earlier in Edo. American demand later reshaped supply chains on the other side of the world too. The modern practice of farming Atlantic salmon, specifically for raw consumption, was developed by Norwegian exporters in the 1980s. They initially targeted the Japanese market before it spread globally. Notably, raw salmon had barely appeared in traditional Japanese sushi before that Norwegian marketing campaign, since wild Pacific salmon commonly carried parasites unsafe to eat raw. The rise of conveyor belt sushi, kaiten sushi, adds one more data point to this same argument. It is about efficiency reshaping the dish. In 1958, restaurateur Yoshiaki Shiraishi opened the first conveyor belt sushi restaurant in Osaka. The idea came directly from conveyor belts he had observed in a beer bottling factory. He was facing labor shortages and needed to serve customers quickly and cheaply. So he adapted an industrial food delivery method to a much older cuisine. That cuisine's entire 800-year history had already been shaped by exactly that same pressure. By 1981, Japanese manufacturers had gone further. They built automated rice-forming machines that could shape thousands of nigiri bases per hour. Those machines, still made by companies like Suzumo, allowed kaiten sushi chains to expand worldwide at low cost. Some modern kaiten sushi chains now use RFID chips embedded in each plate. These chips track how long food has circulated, automatically discarding anything left too long. One major chain, Kura Sushi, has installed automated plate return systems that reward customers with a small game for every 5 plates recycled. Status and pace had once again split into opposite extremes. This echoed the funazushi to nigiri inversion centuries earlier. In 2007, the small 10-seat Tokyo restaurant Sukiyabashi Jiro became the first sushi restaurant awarded 3 Michelin stars. It was run by chef Jiro Ono. Meals there could run several $100s per person for a handful of pieces. The meal was often served in under half an hour. In 2013, UNESCO added washoku, traditional Japanese cuisine, to its intangible cultural heritage list. It cited dishes including sushi as part of the nation's cultural fabric. By the early 2020s, market researchers estimated the global sushi market at tens of billions of dollars annually. The majority of that revenue was generated entirely outside Japan. The same basic technology, a small block of vinegared rice and fish, now existed at both extremes simultaneously. It was a $2 conveyor belt snack and a reservation-only luxury meal, booked months in advance. Now trace the full through line across 13 centuries. Fermentation preserved fish for farmers with no refrigeration. Vinegar faked that fermentation instantly for a growing city that could not wait months. Ice houses kept fresh fish safe for street vendors. A post-war law forced sushi indoors and turned it into a licensed craft. Economic growth inverted a discarded cut into a luxury good. A hidden nori roll, invented 3,000 kilometers from Japan, solved an American diner's discomfort with an unfamiliar ingredient. At every stage, sushi did not change because someone wanted to reinvent tradition for its own sake. It changed because a specific, documented constraint forced an adaptation. A missing refrigerator, a new law, a market shortage, an unfamiliar foreign palate. Even the seaweed wrapping a piece of nigiri survived, only because a scientist on the other side of the world solved a biological puzzle nobody in Japan had cracked. Each of those adaptations was later mistaken by the next generation for a timeless, unbroken tradition. The fish that 18th century diners once discarded as worthless now sells for millions of dollars at auction. The stall food banned by post-war regulators now anchors some of the most expensive dining experiences on Earth. Sushi's history is not a story of continuity. It is a story of repeated, forced reinvention. Each one quietly erased the memory of the reinvention before it, which may be the closest thing this cuisine has ever had to a genuine, enduring tradition of its own.